9 days after we buried my husband, I came home and found my life on the front lawn. Not scattered, stacked. Someone had taken the time to fold my clothes into neat towers on the wet grass, like they wanted the video to look organized, respectable, like this was a donation drive and not the eviction of a woman who hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the funeral. My father-in-law, Gerald Marsh, stood at the top of the porch steps with a clipboard against his chest, like a man about to give a toast. My brother-in-law, Preston, stood a few feet off to the side, phone raised, the little red dot in the corner of his screen, already recording. "There she is," Preston said, not to me, to the phone, to whoever was already watching. "Everyone, this is Eleanor, Dan's wife." Not widow, wife, present tense, like Daniel might walk out of the house behind me and settle this like a man, instead of being 3 weeks in the ground at Fort Callaway National Cemetery. I didn't run to the boxes. I didn't yell. I stood at the edge of my own driveway and did the thing 24 years of federal law enforcement had trained directly into my spine. I counted. 4 moving boxes, 1 clipboard, 1 phone, 2 men who thought a woman standing still meant a woman who had already lost. "You have until sundown," Gerald said, "to sign this and vacate, or we call this abandonment, and abandonment simplifies everything for the estate." Sundown. He'd chosen a word that sounded almost gentle, a word from a man who golfs with judges and chairs the county's Veterans Appreciation Gala every October, the same gala where he'd stood on a stage 2 years ago and called Daniel the bravest man I know, right before the applause, right before the photographers. I looked at the clipboard in his hand. I looked at the phone in Preston's. I looked, longest of all, at the front door, which was still locked, because whatever they'd done, they hadn't gotten inside. Then I said the only 4 words I had for either of them. "Put my things down." Gerald smiled the way men do when they've decided your composure is proof they've already won. "You can have all of it back," he said, "the second you sign." I didn't reach for his paper. I reached into my coat pocket instead, and I pulled out my phone, and I did not call the police, and I did not call a lawyer. I opened the recording app. "Say that again," I said, "for the record." For 1/2 of 1 second, something moved behind Gerald's eyes. Not fear yet, just the first flicker of a man realizing the woman he'd been calling fragile for 2 years had just mirrored his own tactic back at him without raising her voice. He recovered fast. Men like Gerald always do. The first time. He had no idea it would be the only time he'd get to recover from anything for the rest of this story. To understand how we got to a driveway full of my folded clothes, you have to go back 11 days, to a chapel that smelled like lilies and gun oil, where I sat in the front pew in my army dress blues for the first time in 6 years, and where Gerald Marsh leaned across his son's casket to tell me, quietly, so only I could hear it. "You did your part, Eleanor. Now let the family handle the rest." I let that sentence sit exactly where he put it. I had a flag in my lap, folded into a tight triangle by 2 soldiers half my age, and I had promised myself in the hospital hallway 9 days earlier, the hallway where a doctor told me Daniel's heart had simply stopped. Sudden, no warning, no fight, nothing my hands or anyone else's could have stopped, that I would grieve my husband before I dealt with his family. I kept that promise for exactly 6 days. Gerald and Preston's family, that was the phrase Gerald used, in front of 200 people at the reception after the funeral, gesturing at me like I was a category he was still deciding how to classify. To the Marshes, I had always been Dan's wife, the same way a filing cabinet is the thing in the corner of the office. Useful, furniture, not asked what she thought of the room's layout. They knew I'd served 24 years U.S. Army. They knew that the way people know a fact printed on a wedding program. Present, forgettable, unimportant. Next to Daniel's own record, a full bird colonel, Army Corps of Engineers, 2 combat tours, a Purple Heart from an IED outside Kandahar that left him with a permanent limp, and a disability rating that qualified him, on paper, as exactly what his father's company needed. What Gerald did not know, what Preston did not know, what Preston's wife Christine absolutely did not know, was what I actually did for 24 years. I never lied to any of them. Nobody ever asked past the surface long enough for me to have to. I was a Chief Warrant Officer 5 in the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. For the back half of my career, I worked government contract fraud. I spent 2 decades reading the exact kind of paperwork that respectable men use to steal from programs meant for people who bled for this country. Daniel knew. Daniel was the only one who ever really knew, which is exactly why, the night before he died, he left me a voicemail I didn't listen to until 4 days after the funeral because I couldn't make myself press play. When I finally did, it was 11:40 at night in an empty house, and my husband's voice said this: "Ellie, if you're hearing this and I haven't talked to you first, don't sign anything my father sends you. Don't. There's a folder. You'll know it when you see it. And baby, I think I finally get why you never talk about the job. It's because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I can't unsee what's in that folder anymore. I love you. Call Reyes if you need to. He'll know what I mean." 22 seconds. I played it 4 more times that night, not because I'd missed a word, but because it was the last time I would ever hear him say my name. I did not cry where anyone could see it happen. That was never going to be the wound they got to watch. The dismissiveness started small, the way it always does, dressed up as grief management. 3 days after the funeral, I drove to Marsh Development Group's office to collect Daniel's personal effects from his desk. His reading glasses, a photo of the 2 of us at Fort Calloway's retirement ball, a small brass challenge coin he'd carried since Kandahar that he rubbed with his thumb whenever a meeting ran long. The locks had been changed. Not on the whole building, just on Daniel's office door. Corporate policy, the new receptionist told me, a young woman who clearly had no idea what she'd just been handed to say. Mr. Marsh, Gerald, said access needs to be cleared through legal first. I didn't argue with a 23-year-old about her employer's paperwork. I asked one question. Who has the key now? Christine, she said. Preston's wife. She's been organizing the transition. She hesitated, then added it like she was offering me a small comfort. She's actually the one who approves the vendor payments now, too, ever since everything happened. I didn't think much of it in the moment. Grieving families lean on whoever's steadiest, and Christine had always seemed like the steady one. I filed the word away anyway. Transition. The way you file away a signature that's a fraction of a degree off from every other signature in a folder. Not proof of anything yet, just a shape that didn't sit flush. 2 days after that, at the reading of Daniel's will, Gerald sat at the head of a conference table in his own attorney's office, not Daniel's attorney's office, his, and informed me, gently, patiently, like a man explaining taxes to a child, that the house Daniel and I had lived in for 9 years technically sat inside something called the Marsh Family Trust, a document I had never once seen or signed, and that per its terms, primary residency reverted to the family upon the death of the qualifying member. Daniel was the qualifying member, Gerald said. You were his wife. That doesn't make you a trustee. There it was, the sentence built to cost me the most. Not widow, not grieving, but a flat legal demotion, spoken as fact in a room with a court reporter's stenography machine sitting unused in the corner, as if he'd wanted the option to make it official. I asked for a copy of the trust document. Gerald's attorney slid 1 page across the table. 1 page. No notarization block, no witness signatures. A single paragraph, and at the bottom, a signature that was almost Daniel's. I have spent 2 decades looking at almost. I didn't say anything about the signature that day. I folded the page once, put it in my bag, and said 5 words to Gerald that would end up being the only real weapon I used against him for the next 3 weeks. I'll need to review this. Take your time, Gerald said, already smiling like a man closing a door softly so it wouldn't wake the baby he'd just finished lying to. He thought patience was surrender. That mistake would cost him everything. That night, I did what Daniel's voicemail told me to do. I went looking for the folder. I found it exactly where a man who'd spent 2 decades married to a CID agent would hide something he needed kept safe. Not in a safe, not in a drawer, but inside a hollowed-out first aid kit in the garage, wrapped in a plastic bag, the way we'd both been trained to protect anything that might one day need a clean chain of custody. Inside, bank statements, wire transfer records between Marsh Development Group and 3 shell entities I'd never heard of, one of them named Callaway Ridge Holdings. A printed SBA certification, Service Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business, SDVOSB, bearing Daniel's name, his disability rating, his signature, dated 18 months earlier. And a single handwritten note in Daniel's block capitals, the same handwriting he used on deployment maps. "They're using my rating to win contracts I don't run. This is federal. Talk to Reyes." I sat on the garage floor for a long time with that folder in my lap, and for the first time since the hospital hallway, I understood the shape of what my husband had actually died carrying. I knew exactly what I was looking at. The SDVOSB program exists so that companies truly run by a service-disabled veteran get priority on federal contracts, priority Daniel had earned the hard way. What these records showed was what investigators call a rent-a-vet scheme, a real veteran's name and rating used to win contracts he never actually ran, while someone else made every decision behind him. Daniel had signed on in good faith, believing his father wanted him as a real partner. Somewhere in the last 18 months, he'd figured out he was a signature, not a partner. And 3 weeks before he died, the dates on the wires showed him starting to ask questions loud enough that somebody needed him quiet. I don't believe, and I never came to believe, that anyone in that family caused my husband's heart to stop. I believe something colder, and in its own way worse, that the last 3 weeks of his life were spent carrying a secret about people who shared his name, and that the stress of it sat in his chest next to a heart that had already survived one battlefield and didn't survive this one. Gerald didn't put his hands on my husband. He didn't have to. He just made sure Daniel had nowhere safe to put the truth while he was still alive to say it out loud. I made my own decision, sitting on that garage floor, that had nothing to do with rage. I would not fight this family with anger. I would fight it the only way I'd ever known how to win anything that mattered. I would build a case. The next morning, I called Chief Warrant Officer 4, Sam Reyes. Reyes and I had worked fraud together for 6 of my 24 years, the last 2 of them on a joint task force with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. He was still active duty, still assigned to a procurement fraud unit 2 hours away, and when I said the words SDVOSB and Marsh Development Group in the same sentence, he didn't ask why I knew what those words meant. He already knew. "Ellie," he said, "if what you're describing is real, this isn't a family matter anymore. This is federal contracting fraud. You know I can't just open a file because you called me." "I'm not asking you to open a file," I said. "I'm asking you to tell me who I do call, and I'm asking you to tell me how to hold evidence so it doesn't get thrown out later for being handled wrong." There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of an old colleague deciding how much of the job he still owed a retired one. "Chain of custody," he said finally. "Photograph everything before you touch it. Don't let anyone alone with the originals. And Ellie, if this involves an actual SDVOSB certification, there's already an Inspector General's office and an SBA OIG that handle exactly this. If your husband already had documents like this and he was planning to report it, he might already have," I said. "He told me to call you. That's the whole message." Another pause. Longer this time. "Then somebody may already be looking at this," Reyes said. "Sit tight. Don't tip them off. And Ellie, don't let them see you as a threat until it's too late for them to do anything about it." I hung up the phone and looked at myself in the hallway mirror for a second. A 51-year-old widow in a bathrobe, hair undone, eyes swollen from 9 straight nights without real sleep. And I thought about how completely that reflection matched the woman Gerald Marsh believed he was dealing with. Good, I thought. Let him keep believing it a little longer. I hired an attorney the same week, not a family law generalist, but a woman named Marissa Cade who specialized in federal contracting disputes and had, coincidentally, once represented a whistleblower in an SDVOSB case that made her, in Reyes's words, the exact kind of lawyer Gerald Marsh has never had to face. Marissa's first instruction to me was simple. Don't sign the trust document. Don't sign anything. And get a forensic document examiner to look at that signature before you say another word to any of them. The examiner's preliminary read, 2 days later, over a video call, was almost clinical in how little drama it contained. "The pressure pattern's inconsistent with the exemplars you gave me," she said, pointing at 2 overlaid signatures on her screen. "Your husband's genuine signature has a hesitation stroke on the capital D, consistent across every sample from the last decade. This one doesn't have it. I'd want the original document for a full report, but on what I'm seeing, I would not certify this as a match." I didn't feel triumph hearing that. I felt something closer to grief arriving late, showing up to a door it had missed the first time. Marissa saw it on my face, even through the screen. "Ellie," she said gently, "I know this isn't just a case for you, but I need you to let it be one for a little while longer. The version of you that grieves out loud gives them exactly what they want. A woman falling apart, easy to paint as unstable, easy to push out. The version of you that says nothing and keeps building the file is the version that wins." I thought of every debrief I'd ever given a young agent who wanted to charge in before the evidence was locked down. "I know how this works," I told her. "I've been the one giving that speech for 20 years. "Then you already know what comes next," Marissa said. "You let them think they're winning." They believed it completely. Within a week, Preston had started a modest fundraiser online, Help the Marsh Family Through a Painful Estate Dispute, framing me, without naming me directly, as a spouse attempting to exploit a grieving family during their hour of need. It raised $4,000 from people who had never met either of us, and a surprising number of comments calling me things I won't repeat here, all under a video Preston had posted of me standing silently on my own front lawn while my clothes sat folded in the grass, captioned, "This is what happens when you try to help someone and they turn cold." I watched the video once. I did not comment. I did not call Preston. I forwarded the link to Marissa, who added it, without a word of editorializing, to a folder titled Exhibit 14, Public Narrative Construction. Gerald, meanwhile, moved on the house itself, sending a refinancing package to a small regional bank, using the disputed trust document and a fresh set of paperwork listing Marsh Development Group SDVOSB certified as the entity assuming the mortgage, in order to free up cash before what Marissa, checking public procurement records, discovered was an approaching deadline, a routine SBA compliance review of the company's SDVOSB status, scheduled in 11 days. That deadline explained everything. Gerald didn't need the house because he loved his son's memory. He needed liquid cash and a clean-looking balance sheet before a federal reviewer looked too closely at who was actually running Marsh Development Group day-to-day. Because if that reviewer found what Daniel had found, the company would lose its certification, its existing federal contracts, and very possibly face criminal referral. The eviction attempt on my lawn wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a man in a burning building trying to grab the one asset he thought he could still liquidate before the fire reached him. I didn't know yet that the fire had already started 3 weeks earlier, in a folder my husband hid inside a first aid kit. The bank ambush came 4 days after the lawn. Marissa had warned me it might. Gerald requested a meeting to finalize paperwork amicably at a small regional bank branch, in a private conference room with a loan officer already primed to notarize whatever was placed in front of him. Preston was there, so for the first time was Christine. Christine Marsh had always registered to me as the quiet one, Preston's wife of 6 years, soft-spoken at holidays, the one who sent thoughtful cards, the one everyone described as the sweet one who keeps Preston grounded. She sat at that conference table with a leather folio in front of her, and she was the one, not Gerald, who slid the final refinancing package across the table toward me. "We just want this to be easy for everyone," she said, her voice warm in a way that didn't match the paperwork she was pushing. "You don't have to be alone in this, Ellie. I know what it's like to feel outnumbered by this family." It was, I'll admit, a well-built sentence. Sympathetic. Designed to make me feel like she and I were 2 women navigating marshmen together. I read every page before I answered her. Page 3 named the loan servicer as a company called Callaway Ridge Holdings, LLC. I knew that name. I'd seen it once already, in Daniel's folder, and now here it was again, listed as the recipient of 2 payments totaling just under $90,000 from Marsh Development Group, 12 days apart, 8 months earlier. "Who owns Callaway Ridge Holdings?" I asked, keeping my voice as flat as the paper in front of me. Christine's smile didn't move, but her hand did. A small adjustment of the folio's edge, squaring it against the table. The kind of unconscious motion people make when a question lands somewhere they weren't ready for it to land. "It's a family entity," Gerald said, too quickly, before Christine could answer for herself. "Nothing complicated." "I didn't ask you," I said, still looking at Christine. She recovered in half a second, faster than Gerald ever had, I noticed, and said, "It's a holding company Preston and I set up for tax purposes." I didn't push further. I signed nothing. I stood, thanked the loan officer for his time, and left the branch with Marissa's business card still sitting untouched in my bag, because I'd already decided I didn't need to say another word in that room. I had what I needed. The mask on Christine had slipped exactly once, and once was enough for someone trained to read a room for a living. I called Marissa from the parking lot. "Callaway Ridge Holdings," I said. "Run it against every entity connected to the SDVOSB filing." 2 days later, a courier envelope arrived from Marissa's office, copies pulled from the State Business Registry and the SDVOSB compliance file. I spread them across my kitchen table before I called her back, the same way I used to lay out evidence in a briefing room, one document at a time, corners squared, nothing touching until I understood how it connected to everything else. On the left, the wire transfer records from Daniel's folder, 2 payments to Callaway Ridge Holdings, 80 days apart. On the right, the LLC's state filing, one name typed cleanly into the box marked sole member, Christine A. Marsh. Beneath that, 11 months of invoices for something called Strategic Operations Consulting, each one signed with the same small, tidy signature I'd once mistaken for a comfort. Marissa picked up on the second ring. "You're looking at it right now, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Ellie, that management fee structure is exactly what an SDVOSB certification exists to prevent. If Christine's the one actually directing day-to-day operations and taking a fee to do it, then Daniel was never the one running that company. He was the name on the door." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was thinking about a receptionist, weeks earlier, telling me Christine approved the vendor payments now, and how easily I'd let that detail slide past me as nothing. Everyone in that family had spent months assuming Gerald was the architect and Preston was his obedient son. Preston himself likely believed that. What none of them seemed to understand, what Christine had built quietly enough that even her own husband may not have fully grasped it, was that the company's real operating structure ran through her, not through either Marshman, whose name was on the door. Preston, I would later learn, had been drowning in his own private problem for over a year, a gambling debt north of $200,000, hidden from his father, discovered by his wife, and quietly absorbed into the company's books by Christine, in exchange for a controlling hand in decisions Preston no longer had the standing to make. He hadn't married a mastermind by accident. He'd handed her the keys without noticing. I called Reyes that same evening. "I have a name for you," I said. "Callaway Ridge Holdings, sole member Christine Marsh. Management fees inconsistent with SDVOSB day-to-day control requirements." "Ellie," Reyes said, and I heard something shift in his voice. The sound of a man realizing a file he'd flagged as possible had just become probable. "I need to tell you something. I wasn't supposed to say this yet. Daniel already filed a complaint, 3 weeks before he died, with the SBA's Office of Inspector General and the Defense Contract Audit Agency. It's why the compliance review got moved up 11 days. He started this before either of us did." I closed my eyes. My husband hadn't just been carrying a secret. He'd already lit the fuse himself, quietly, the way he did everything, and had simply run out of time before he did tell me he'd already made the call. "Trust the paperwork," his voicemail had said, without ever quite saying it in those words. "Trust yourself." He'd trusted the process before he trusted anyone to protect him personally. That was, I realized, the single most Daniel thing he had ever done, and it broke something loose in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel since the hospital hallway. I let myself cry for exactly 4 minutes that night. Then I picked the folder back up and kept working. Gerald tried one more thing before he ran out of moves, and it was the only time this entire ordeal came close to touching me physically. 3 days after the call with Reyes, a moving truck pulled into my driveway at 7 in the morning, unannounced, along with a man I didn't recognize, wearing a security company polo and a clipboard that wasn't his. Gerald had apparently decided that if paperwork couldn't move me out, a truck and a stranger might. "Ma'am, we have a work order to begin removal of non-essential items," the man said, already walking toward my porch like the sentence itself was a key. "You don't," I said. "Show me who signed it." He didn't show me anything. He reached for the porch railing to step past me toward the front door, and his forearm came into my space fast enough that I didn't have time to simply ask him again. I didn't raise a hand to him. I shifted my weight off my back foot, turned my hip a quarter step out of his path, and let his own forward momentum carry his reaching arm past where I'd been standing a half second earlier. My hand found his wrist only long enough to redirect it downward, toward the railing instead of toward me. And by the time he'd registered that his balance had shifted, I had already put 3 feet of open porch back between us. No shouting, no blood, just a grown man briefly off balance on his own 2 feet, blinking at a 51-year-old woman who hadn't so much as raised her voice. "Don't reach for me again," I said. "Not on my property, not anywhere." He didn't. He backed toward the truck, radioed someone, and within 4 minutes, the truck was gone. The driver clearly having decided that whatever Gerald was paying him did not cover finding out what else I knew how to do with a stranger's own weight against him. I photographed the truck's license plate before it left. I texted the photo to Marissa with 3 words: "Attempted forced entry." Her reply came within a minute, adding it to the file. "Do not engage again without me on the phone." I didn't need to engage again. Gerald had just handed his own attorney a problem far larger than an eviction dispute, an attempted forced removal, on video from my own doorbell camera, time-stamped 4 days before a federal compliance review of his company. Marissa later told me it was the single piece of evidence that made the family's remaining private attorney recommend, in writing, that Gerald stop contacting me altogether. He didn't listen to that advice either. Men like Gerald rarely take the first warning seriously. It's usually the second one, delivered by someone wearing a federal badge instead of a family name, that finally lands. Gerald's false victory came 6 days later, and I let him have every second of it. He believed, based on Christine's confident reassurance, that the refinancing had gone through on a secondary channel, that the compliance review would find nothing because Marsh Development Group's paperwork technically listed Daniel as managing member, and that I, grieving, silent, apparently cooperative enough not to have sued anyone yet, had simply run out of fight. He called me himself 2 days before the SBA review to invite me to what he called a small remembrance gathering at the Fort Calloway Armory, where the Post's Community Support Office was hosting a brief ceremony to formally close out Daniel's final personnel actions and present a meritorious service commendation the Army had approved for Daniel's disability advocacy work in his final years, a piece of routine honors business that had been scheduled weeks before any of this began, entirely independent of me, entirely independent of Gerald. "It would mean a great deal to the family," Gerald said, "if you'd attend and let this be a peaceful chapter. No hard feelings, Eleanor. We're still family." I said yes, not because I forgave him, because Marissa had, by then, confirmed that federal investigators, SBA OIG, and a DCIS agent working alongside them intended to serve a subpoena for Marsh Development Group's financial records within the week, and I did not intend to miss the moment those 2 timelines finally crossed. I wore my dress blues. I hadn't worn them since Daniel's funeral. I put on every ribbon I'd earned in 24 years, including the ones nobody in that family had ever once asked me about, and I drove to the armory with Marissa's number in one pocket and Daniel's challenge coin in the other. The armory smelled like floor wax and old coffee, folding chairs arranged in careful rows under a wall of unit flags. Gerald stood near the front in a dark suit, greeting arriving guests like a man hosting a wedding. Preston stood beside Christine, who wore the same warm, unbothered smile she'd worn at the bank. None of them had noticed the 2 people standing quietly near the back exit, a woman in a plain gray suit with a visitor's badge clipped to her lapel, and a man in Army combat uniform whose name tape read Reyes. I sat in the front row. Gerald sat beside me, close enough to lean over during the opening remarks and murmur, "I'm glad you came around, Eleanor. Daniel would have wanted this." I didn't answer him. I was watching the door. At 10:14, a major general named Patricia Hollis, the post's senior commanding officer for personnel affairs, walked to the small podium to read the citation for Daniel's commendation. She had never met me. She had no idea what was sitting in the room beside the folded flag on the table. She read the citation the way officers read them, plainly, without theater, letting the facts carry their own weight. Daniel's advocacy work for disabled veterans navigating federal small business certification. His insistence, in his final months, on transparency in programs meant to protect people exactly like him. Then General Hollis looked up from the page, and her eyes moved past Gerald, past Preston, and landed on me. "Before I close," she said, "I understand Colonel Marsh's widow served in this uniform herself. Chief Warrant Officer 5, Eleanor Marsh, is that correct?" The room did not erupt into gasps or dramatic movement. What happened instead was smaller, and to me, far more devastating. I watched Gerald's expression change in real time, not into shock, but into the specific, quiet confusion of a man realizing a word he'd been using for 2 years. Paperwork, administrative, just Dan's wife, had never once been accurate, and that everyone in the room was about to find that out at the same moment he did. "Yes, ma'am," I said, standing. 24 years, Army CID, contract fraud investigations, General Hollis said, reading from a line on the visitor roster that the post's security office had flagged automatically the moment my old CID credentials pulled up at the gate check-in that morning. Nobody had arranged it. It was simply what happened when a retired warrant officer with my file walked through a gate that still recognized her clearance history. That's not a small record, Chief. "No, ma'am," I said. "It isn't." I did not explain further. I had spent 2 decades learning that the sentence, "you don't need to know," is sometimes the most honest thing a person in my line of work can say, and I said a version of it now, to a room instead of to one man, simply by saying nothing more. General Hollis gave a short nod, not a salute, not theater, just the plain professional respect of one senior service member to another, and returned to closing the ceremony. That was the whole moment. No trumpets, no dramatic reveal monologue, just a general reading a fact out loud in a room full of people who had spent 2 years deciding I wasn't worth asking about. It was, somehow, exactly enough. I sat back down. Beside me, Gerald had gone quiet in a way I'd never once heard from him. Not the calculated silence of a man choosing his next move, but the plain, unrehearsed silence of a man realizing he'd spent 2 years writing a character in his head and calling her his son's wife, without once checking whether the character matched the person. Preston, 3 rows back, had lowered his phone entirely, for the first time since I'd arrived. Christine hadn't moved at all, and that stillness told me more than any reaction would have. She was already recalculating, the way people do when a variable they'd priced at 0 turns out to carry weight. The second arrival came 11 minutes later, and it belonged entirely to Daniel, not to me. 2 federal investigators, a DCIS special agent, and an SBA Office of Inspector General auditor, approached Gerald and Christine as the crowd began filtering toward refreshments in the adjoining hall. They were polite. They were quiet. They asked Gerald and Christine to step into a side office to discuss some irregularities identified in a routine compliance review of Marsh Development Group's SDVOSB certification. Gerald's voice carried further than he meant it to. "This is a family event," he said. "Surely this can wait." "It can't, sir," the DCIS agent said. "We have documentation suggesting your son filed a formal complaint 3 weeks before his death. We'll need to speak with all listed officers of the company." Preston, standing a few feet away, went very still. Not the theatrical stillness of shock, but the specific stillness of a man doing fast arithmetic on how much of this could still be pinned somewhere other than himself. He looked at his wife. Christine did not look back at him. Whatever calculation she'd been running since the general's words landed in that room, she'd apparently finished it. She reached calmly into her folio, produced a business card, and handed it to the agent without being asked. I recognized the choice for what it was, the same one I trained 100 young agents to watch for. The moment a suspect stops fighting the file, because they finally understood how much of it is already real. 10 minutes earlier, she might have gambled on outlasting a grieving daughter-in-law. She wasn't gambling on that anymore. "I'll cooperate fully," she said. "As sole owner of Callaway Ridge Holdings, I'd like counsel present." It was, I realized watching it happen, the first fully honest sentence I had ever heard Christine Marsh say. Preston found me 20 minutes later in the parking lot, his tie loosened, his face doing the thing faces do when a person finally runs out of story to tell themselves. "I didn't know she owned that much of it," he said. "I swear to God, Ellie, I thought I was signing off on tax stuff." "You knew about the gambling," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. She said she'd handle it. I let her handle everything after that. "Then you have a decision to make," I said, "about whether you keep letting other people handle the truth for you." I didn't offer him comfort. I didn't offer him blame either. I got in my car and left him standing in the lot with his phone in his hand, no longer recording anything for the first time in 3 weeks. The consequences, once they started, moved with the particular unglamorous slowness of federal process, which is to say they were thorough and they did not stop. Within a month, Marsh Development Group's SDVOSB certification was suspended pending investigation, and 2 active federal contracts, worth just under $4 million combined, were frozen. The regional bank, alerted to the pending fraud inquiry, declined to finalize any refinancing on my house, and the disputed 1-page family trust document was withdrawn from probate entirely once Marissa formally submitted the forensic examiner's report questioning its authenticity. Christine faced the most serious exposure. The SBA OIG's preliminary findings described Callaway Ridge Holdings as functioning, in practice, as the true operational controller of the company, a direct violation of program requirements, layered with potential wire fraud charges tied to the management fee structure. Her cooperation bought her a seat at the negotiating table, not a clean exit. Gerald lost the company's federal contracting eligibility outright, and within weeks resigned his position chairing the county's Veterans Appreciation Gala after 2 board members quietly requested it. He never apologized to me directly. The closest he came was a single voicemail, weeks later, that I did not return, in which he said, "I didn't know what you actually did over there, Eleanor. I should have asked." I let that sentence sit exactly where he'd left it, the same way he'd once let his to me sit over his son's casket. Preston cooperated with investigators, providing internal records that helped establish the timeline of Christine's management fees, in exchange for what his own attorney described as favorable treatment regarding his personal financial conduct. It didn't erase what he'd done. It did, in Marissa's clinical phrase, meaningfully differentiate his exposure from his father's and his wife's. I kept the house, not because a trust document said so, but because there had never been a valid one in the first place, and because Daniel's actual will, the real one, filed properly years earlier, the one nobody had bothered producing until Marissa subpoenaed it, left it to me outright, in his own handwriting, with the hesitation stroke on the capital D exactly where it belonged. I still see Preston sometimes. Not often. He calls on Daniel's birthday, and last spring he asked carefully if he could come by and see the garage, the same garage where I'd found the folder that started all of this. I let him. He stood in front of that shelf for a long time and didn't say much. I have not spoken to Gerald since the parking lot. I don't know if I ever will. I've made my peace with the fact that some doors close because the other side never bothered to knock properly in the first place. Daniel's challenge coin sits on my kitchen windowsill now, where I can see it every morning with my coffee. Some mornings I still reach for the phone before I remember there's no one left to call about the small, ordinary things. That particular kind of missing someone doesn't fully go away. I've stopped expecting it to. What I did keep, what I chose to keep, was the plain, unglamorous discipline that got me through this. Build the file before you raise your voice. Let the paperwork carry what the shouting never will. And never let anyone else's low opinion of you decide what you're capable of proving. Some grief you don't file away. You just learn to carry it standing up.